Thank you very much for inviting me here to talk. I appreciate this space within the increasingly conservative UK sector to talk positively about harm reduction and have open dialogue. I'm going to be presenting to you today an emerging tool that we've been developing called the K-Check. This follows on from some work we've been doing collaboratively among a number of different health care professionals and practitioners and drug users. Really trying to respond to ketamine, particularly in the absence of a response from the National Treatment Agency, who've really refused to engage with ketamine and not wanting to tackle it as an issue. So the tool itself is a parallel tool to a tool that I developed with Chris Ford from the Royal College of General Practice, which was a tool called the 8-point health check for crack users, which appeared as part of the Royal College's guidelines on crack cocaine. And it was a really practical tool designed to empower GPs who were often terrified of working with crack users, almost as terrified as the crack users were of going to see the GPs. So that there was a sort of way of actually saying, look, here's some really practical things you can do as a GP to assess someone coming in with crack-related issues that helps you feel empowered as a GP because it's doing routine healthcare screening. So this is what we were trying to do, and now we're trying to produce a parallel intervention with ketamine. And so this is designed to empower primary care workers and also to reduce stigma and increase understanding, because I think one of the things we're now seeing is that ketamine users are becoming the sort of third most demonised group of drug users in the UK. If we talk about terms like kiddie smack and wibbly wobbly techno smack, it's very much designed, orientating ketamine within this demonised group of drug users. So, who uses ketamine? And I think it's important to recognise that there are some quite distinct populations of ketamine users, and our responses and interventions might need to be different to those different groups, and arguably they probably have quite different risk profiles in terms of their using as well. So I think there's really classically sort of three key populations. The first is what I call the clubbers, importantly spelt with a K, and these are people who are taking ketamine in what we would call bumps, so often from a nasal, from one of these little tutors. Some will go on to take full lines, but it's much more practical often to take bumps, often using in a club setting, often using alongside other drugs like MDMA, but we know from the New York scene and also increasingly in the UK, there are also exclusively ketamine-based club scenes. And these are people taking short bursts of the drug and probably taking it reasonably frequently over a night, but they're wanting to dance, so they don't want to be in such a dissociative state that they can't dance. So there's a sense of people wanting to be in that creative space, but still wanting to be relatively conscious while they're doing it. The next group is what we call the psychonauts. And the psychonauts follow a very long-standing tradition of exploring spiritual paths, exploring your internal mind states, and not necessarily always doing that with drugs. So doing that through meditation, doing that through yoga, doing that through a range of different meditative practices. But ketamine seems to get you there without having to learn all those techniques. And so there's a huge advantage. It's a much less controlled way of entering those spaces as well. So it's much more like a pick and mix. You don't quite know which one you're going to get. There's near-death experience or rebirth experience or something quite challenging like that. But on some level, that's some of the excitement. It's quite interesting to not always know what's going to happen next when you're taking drugs. And what some of this group will do is also, like myself, use yoga and meditation and other ways to manage their drug taking. So for me, my first dose of ketamine is always taken post-meditation because it gives me the most enhanced experience, and it also helps me regulate control because that helps me have the drug there and I don't immediately take it, so it brings in a space of control. So this is a very different group of drug takers. And then the next group is the group that seem to just dive in. So this group are using probably between 50 milligrams and 200 milligrams per dose, tend to be either snorters or IM users, intramuscular users. They give sort of relatively parallel doses, and I'm an intramuscular user at this point. I started off here and have now moved into this group. The other group are the sort of K-dependent, and this is a group that seem to just, in my view, just let go and just sort of go, way, ketamine, and just sort of plough into it without any sense of awareness of what the drug was doing. This group there's been a long tradition of people writing books, and there's a sort of you really feel that you're quite consciously travelling into these spaces. This group just seem to dive in and take as much drugs as they can and get into quite substantial problems. At this point, I've been reminded by Adam to highlight the app on ketamine, which is a way of actually testing where you fall in this sort of space. Now, what are you using? This group are often looking for K-holing. Now, they're looking to go into an anaesthetic state, and their desires are very much more around what you might see around heroin, and people just saying, look, my life's really troublesome, or really, no, I find the external world difficult to engage in. I'm just going to get out of it. And so when we start talking to dose management and tolerance management to this group, they're often going, but I just want to get fucked. That's what I want. No, so there's a sort of interesting dialogue between what you're trying to do. So I'm not swearing again, so I did say I'll try not to. So in terms of thinking about the effects of ketamine, I'm going to be moving reasonably rapidly through this because it's there's quite a lot to say. I think ketamine is the Marmite of drugs. Now, people either love it or they hate it. And it does tend to really create this polarised engagement, because some people just don't like going into these dissociative states, and other people think it's, like myself, think it's fantastic. So it's a short-acting dissociative anaesthetic. The onset is about 2 to 10 minutes, and obviously that varies depending on your route of administration. And I missed out one thing on the route of administration. A lot of the K-dependent group are now moving into IV use, which is obviously the most effective way of getting into that dissociative state quickly. Duration tends to be about 20 minutes to an hour. It's usually good to leave about half an hour between dosing, because otherwise you get into dose stacking. But there is also a residual effect. So, to get your full vision back, be able to clearly read computer text or television, takes a little bit longer than the acute or the sort of active state. What's happening is it's inducing a mind-body separation. So it's almost like a sort of bit of free time for your mind, a bit of sort of partying away from the responsibilities of running your body, which is where you get into this sort of with the external stimuli turned off, your brain then goes into creating these internal worlds or these internal states. What's interesting about it is there's also, as I've said, a lot of parallels with some sort of spiritual journeying, and some of the states that we're able to go into with ketamine are these states that people would almost try to consciously travel with. So what's going on here is you've got, so you can't read all the bits underneath it. So what you've got here is essentially this 10% of your brain, your mind is working on, is the conscious part of your mind, relatively new in evolutionary terms. The 90% is your unconscious mind going on underneath. Now this is the bit that affects, conscious is where you have the short-term memory, heavily impacted by ketamine. But however, that's interesting because many of the spiritual practices are around staying in the moment. And short-term memory loss forces you to stay in the moment. For someone like me who has a whirring brain, it's brilliant. Now I can have time off from that whirring brain. For other people, and if you're trying to use it in a workspace, it's much less helpful because you won't be able to remember what you're doing. And at higher doses, your recall of the events will actually be very limited. So one of the things that drives the psychonautas away from very high dose using is actually we would quite like to recall what happens as much as we can, recognising that veil between the ketamine state and the conscious state is always a bit blurry, and you often have a sense of feeling or memory, or it's not a full recall. But no, I've been in parties where I've high dosed and didn't do it again because I got to the end of the party and couldn't remember anything that had happened. So there's a sort of sense in which that, for some people, is driving you away. The K-dependent group might be going, actually, that's fantastic. So it means I don't have to engage with my life and can just opt out. In terms of form, when I first started using ketamine, actually I said in my biography I've been using ketamine for 10 years. I realise it's actually over 20 years now. That's my short-term memory loss going again. We were using liquid ketamine, either in amps or in often coming over in litre bottles, which was coming over as rose water. For a long time, they didn't realise that literally pallet loads were coming in through Heathrow on a regular basis. Unfortunately, the bottle supply went out right down the chain in these rose water bottles, and eventually the police caught on and caught the man with the pallets, and he gave up the whole network. And that's where we had a big drought of ketamine for a period of time, which again led a lot of ketamine users into mixing their drugs and moving into different forms of drug taking. What we now have is these two forms of crystal ketamine. John Ramsey has done some very good testing for us to show that actually these are still ketamine hydrochloride. One comes from India, one comes from China. They often tend to be made in manufactured in factories that make ketamine, the illegal teams come in at night and take over the factory at night and produce a whole batch that goes out to the illicit market, but actually uses the main industry. The problem with this crystal is it's much sharper. So what a lot of users do is they cook it up with water and then dehydrate it again, which is what we were doing with this version. Actually, all that does is bring a load of bacteria into the product, and all it does is degrades the product, because when you heat it, it degrades the quality. But I'm finding it very, very difficult to persuade people to move away from this, because it's something that's become very traditionally embodied. People even like the warm feeling of the ketamine in their nose after they've cooked it up. So you can see that actually once practices have become culturally embedded, they're often quite difficult to shift. What we're trying to encourage, and what definitely my peer group use, is pestle and mortar. So you just take a pestle and mortar to the crystal and grind it down into a powder, therefore not degrading the product, not bringing lots of impurities into the product, which, dirty old frying pans with bits. I've literally seen bits of black plastic where the cooking equipment is like melting as they're heating it. But actually all you need to do is, if you're an injector, stick it straight in water and cook it up. If you're a snorter, grind it down. However, one of the challenges we're facing with lots of young people, or people in their 20s now who've still not left home, is that when I try to give this advice to peer networks of younger people, or even in their 20s, actually many of them don't have the capacity to keep scales at home or pestle and mortar at home, because their mum and dad, they're still living with their mum and dad, and drug use is increasingly pushed outside the home. And that's a real problem for ketamine, because one of our biggest pieces of advice is use in a safe environment, use at home. And that's why we see kids on the streets and in different settings using. I think it's important that we're now talking about why is it that we're now starting to see such problems with ketamine. This isn't something we've seen within the medical usage of the drug. It's not something we saw among the early generation of psychonauters from the 1970s onwards. And we didn't really even see huge problems among the early clubbers on the gay scenes in London and New York. But now we're suddenly starting to see this huge array of problems. So am I banging my mic? Which one is one? Okay. And so I think it's important to understand the social context within which these changes are taking place. If we're looking at the threat, clearly the level of criminalisation among people who use ketamine has gone up. Now the government, in a reasonably reactionary process, actually to not substantial harm, reacted to political pressure and made the drug class C. Now what that's done effectively is, with also the importation, the more successful interruption of the importation routes, we now have a product on the market which is much more able to cut. So we're now seeing ketamine being cut much more routinely than we were before. In fact, ketamine was always known for being a drug that when you brought it, it tended to be what it is. That's increasingly not the case. We're seeing huge problems of ketamine users being very vulnerable because they're very visible, because they're forced out into the open. They're left in spaces where they're much more physically, much more identified. And because of the criminalisation, although it's very low level, because this group are often university students, they're often people training for professional careers, not exclusively so, but heavily so. I'm seeing a lot of drug users who have been arrested while snorting ketamine in a changing room of a shop, wobbling out of the changing room with a polo around the nose. Some busybody security guard picks them up, calls the police. The person gets a caution, and their teaching career goes down the drain. So you're seeing, of this very low-level criminalisation, a disproportionately high effect on people's long-term careers. And I've seen, just in my own group, I'm dealing with 4 people at the moment who we're trying to resurrect their careers as they come out as students, having just graduated, but they've now got this CRB check on their licence. And when you're in a competitive market, when they're going through the CVs, you've got a ketamine CRB check, you're just thrown straight out, and that's the real problem for people. We're also now suddenly seeing this huge array of physical problems. Ketamine, firstly, ketamine dependency, secondly, ketamine bladder syndrome, and also the problems around K-cramps, which are probably to do with bile duct inflammation. So some pretty serious health problems being experienced by some ketamine users. The challenge is, and this is where I can get pretty angry around this sort of stuff, having been working on this and trying to advocate for this and do all this work for no money, because actually the government is just not interested, because what the NTA have said is, actually this is not a critical population because they don't commit crime. And this is, people have seriously said this. We've gone back to the NTA about 3 or 4 times with more and more professionals, more and more urologists, more and more different neuroscientists saying, look, you've got to intervene. And they're just saying, no, this is either a regional problem or it's not, they're not criminals. Urologists are saying, our services are about to be swamped because these young people who then need to have their bladders replaced, they'll be coming to us for the rest of their lives from the age of 20. So urologists are saying, for God's sake, somebody intervene. And when you read the urology papers, there's a real sense of panic in there, which I think is well justified. However small the population is out of the total population, a group of people with chronic bladder problems who are going to need treatment for the next 60 years is a huge health cost burden. Thank you. And peers are saying there's problems and professionals are saying there are problems, which is where the sort of K-Day process has come from. So in terms of setting issues, so I think I've talked about this already. This is just the fact that people are much, much more exposed. The best option for people is to stay at home. This is increasingly a limited option for young people. Increasingly, young people call their parents the rents, which I think really highlights the fact that young people are increasingly stuck at home, and that really, given the generational differences around drug taking, creates real problems for people. And it's something I hear peer groups talking about all the time. Trying to be respectful, trying to be safe, trying to get those balances right, and try not to scare their parents, but at the same time, try not to get into health problems. The other issue about this is that using ketamine, being around people using ketamine isn't that much fun, to be honest, and therefore it's not like clubbing where you could get the euphoric buzz of being around people with ecstasy. It's really quite boring being around ketamine users, and that's fostering greater stigmatization because you look pretty strange when you're on ketamine. And just here's a little example. This is people in the street in Russia just spotting somebody using ketamine. Interested in their response is to video him rather than pull him out of the road. The fact you can see this guy quite struggling to have his mobility and to have his motor functioning working. You can imagine if you don't understand ketamine and you're not sure what this is about, or this is your son or daughter, that could be pretty scary. In terms of K-holes are a full dissociative state. They can be, they're pretty near to or full dose anesthesia. There's a full disconnect from the body and a sort of dropping into this state of bliss, but you can look pretty weird. There's lots and lots of different things that can be going on psychologically, and Carl Janssen's book on ketamine is a really good resource around this. The key things that we need to teach people is that firstly, it's about management strategies. Don't allow people's airways to be blocked. Watch out for people with injuries. I've seen people just literally go from standing to falling, crashing on the floor, missing a glass coffee table by inches. And you can really see how we've got to think about the spaces we're using as well. And then recognising as people come out of K-holes, we need to create calm spaces for people. We don't need to harass people about coming back to consciousness. We just need to hold them in a safe space. But remembering, and I remember this the first time I ever saw a ketamine, someone walk away from taking a line and just sort of go down as they went, is that people very rarely, this is not a life-threatening situation as long as we keep the airways open. However, as one of my peer groups saw, I taught them about some just managing airways, and literally the next party they were at, they saw someone lying on the ground and saved their life by stopping everybody else around them, just dancing around them as this person was going blue on the floor and nobody noticed. In terms of physical health, death is rare. I think the issues we're looking at are site-related, administration issues like lots of nose problems. This is a hydrochloride-based drug like cocaine, and we're seeing similar problems to cocaine. Probably not quite so severe, but definitely reports of users with no symptoms and all of those types of problems. Injecting can be an issue. It's actually not too bad a drug to inject because it is a local anaesthetic. For intramuscular, that's great. For IV, that's less great. So there's some challenges around that. K-cramps and K-pain, which is this cholangitis, which is inflamed bile ducts, looking potentially at liver damage. We need to watch where there is potential liver damage. And potentially also something called chemibelly, which is where ketamine is now going down the back of someone's nose and hitting their stomach and causing acidic problems in the stomach. And that is something, so you're increasingly seeing spittoons appearing in using environments where ketamine users are experiencing a learning to suck out and spit out the ketamine. A lot of that's to do with the fact they're using such high doses in the first place. They're chucking far too much powder up their nose, which is, if they could actually manage their dose, they wouldn't have to do that. So this is a new phenomenon, but I think it's very reflective of high dose using. So let's go on to the horror story of ketamine bladder syndrome. And no, I think we're talking as if this is a very universal factor, which I don't think it is. I think we're talking, probably, I think something in the literature, the really severe cases, something about 100 worldwide so far, but I think it's massively underreported. I think people are, I see Adam shaking his head. I think there's lots of people who have low-level infections. I definitely have had cystitis at one point. Never went to a doctor around it. No, had urine in my blood in my urine, and freaked out and changed my practices as a result. So I'm sure there's a lot of unreported problems going on as well. What is going on? Well, the symptoms are pretty clear. Going to the toilet very, very repeatedly. Sometimes up to every 15 minutes, people talking about going to the toilet 20 to 40 times a day. Very, very debilitating. Reducing size of bladder. And extreme pain in the bladder as well. So what's going on is people are having, similar to cystitis, also bladder hardening of the bladder wall. And if this goes into chronic problems, you're really looking at people having bladders removed, stents introduced so they have to catheterize themselves. Some really quite severe problems. If you get into that acute chronic, if you get into the real chronic problems, you're really talking about abstinence. And I think that's a really important message to give to drug users, is that, if you don't manage this, you won't be able to use this drug anymore without doing life-changing damage to your body. So that hydration becomes really important. Now, I think one of the things that's going on in the bladder is the chemical residue from the drug. So if you drink more, you flush that through better. So there are definitely high-dose users who aren't having these problems, but they tend to be people who hydrate well. Just in terms of mental health, so short-term memory is one issue. It's an issue that's affecting your conscious mind. The key is to actually come out of ketamine use to allow your conscious mind to then re-establish control and not be disassociated. However, if you're never doing that or rarely doing that, then you're not giving then you're going to be facing quite long-term mental health, short-term memory issues. As I've said, it has positive effects as well as negative. K-holing, or going into these very extreme dissociative states, is something that can be very therapeutic. It can be something that can lead to quite cathartic episodes. I've seen people go in a held environment can be very useful for people. In an unheld environment, happening in the middle of a club or the middle of a street or on a street corner, those can be quite psychologically challenging, and people, I think, often need to be debriefed sometimes on those episodes, and they're often the episodes that scare people away from using ketamine as well. Depression is something that also occurs, particularly among people who try to stop or people who are stuck in K-dependency. However, interestingly, ketamine is also a treatment for depression. So for other people, it's having a very positive effect, and there's good research that shows that ketamine can, for example, reboot the brain and allow people who are having depression that's untreatable otherwise, can either have it cured or can at least allow other medications to start working. One of the key issues that we are facing is the issue of tolerance. Ketamine tolerance rises in a session. So I might start my using session at, say, around 50 milligrams. By the end of a session, I may be up to something like 125 milligrams. Okay, and I'll just bet 1 more 2 minutes, is that all right? Yeah. But the big problem, and this is where we're seeing the problems with dependent ketamine users, is where then just not taking breaks between sessions, so the tolerance never drops back down again. I've got peers now who talk about saying, I can stop for 2 or 3 months and my tolerance doesn't come back. So something seems to be going on among those really chronic users, which is quite different from the psychonauts. The psychonauts seem to be able to have much more planned episodes, breaks, use for maybe 3 or 4 days, pull out, and that seems to work. As soon as you start to not allow proper breaks, then you start to move into K-dependency, and they're the group getting hit by ketamine bladder syndrome, and by a whole range of other health issues. Yeah, so dependency is really just, it's not a physical dependency, but it's one that people talk about being really trapped in. Now, people with full bladder dependency syndrome going back to using again because they can't break out of it. So however much they know they're killing themselves or doing real damage, they also struggle to break away from it. Highly compulsive in that way. And I think there's a group of people for whom it's a bit like sort of smoking cannabis when you're a teenager, that sort of process of almost pulling back and dropping out of a world that you're struggling to cope with. So this really leads us to this intervention, which is clearly we have a drug that generally doesn't cause substantial problems. It's a relatively safe drug to use, but for some people it's causing extremely dangerous problems. But those people are often presenting very late to healthcare services, and when they do present, they don't tell the people what's actually going on. They present the symptoms rather than the underlying causes. So this brings us on to this intervention. I wish you can't read at all, which is really helpful. It brings us on to this intervention, which is the K-check, which is a lot of really interesting questions, which you'll be able to read online, which essentially just guide us to ask people questions, to test those various different areas so we can make decisions about, is this someone who needs harm reduction advice? Is this someone who needs some guidance? Is this someone having a short-term problem? Or is this actually one of these people having these really chronic conditions that we really need to intervene with as fast as possible? And finally, because we are doing this work for free, because we can't get government funding, I am looking for people who might be interested in piloting this resource as we move into the next phase. So if you're interested in that, here's all my contact details.